World War I is broken down into a number of some categories. You can only see online right now 3 of them. One is called At the Front, and the other is At Home, and I've broken At Home down into getting ready for the war and what was happening at home during the war. We're going to start with World War I at the front, what took place at the front. And we're going to break at the front down to 3 things, and we're actually going to do the same thing when we do World War II. 3 things will be on land, at sea, and in the air, okay? But we're going to start with the most important one in World War I, which is on the land. Now, Canadian troops fought in 2 countries in World War I. They were France and Belgium. They fought against Germany, but they fought in 2 countries, France and Belgium. The war in World War I was a war of attrition. And as you know, a war of attrition is a war where the 2 sides wear each other down, okay? It was a war of attrition because of the use of technology like the machine gun and artillery, especially the machine gun. The machine gun made it so that men were having to fight in trenches, and in those trenches, all right, the slaughter was horrible. As we described, morning Maddie, as we described, they were basically fighting by the end of the war in a graveyard. It was just a giant cemetery. The trenches never moved anywhere. So the words so far that you'll need to know would be, of course, attrition, which is wearing each other down. I always use the Rocky example, the 2 fighters who can't knock each other out. And Canada took part in this. We lost 60,000 men at the front. The nature of the war led to incredible carnage. The first battle Canada took part in, and there's going to be 5 battles I'm going to need to know about the land, okay? 5 battles. The first one is Ypres, and, or as the troops called it, Ypres. It was actually the 2nd battle of Ypres, the first time Canada took part. And we remember Ypres because, you can yell it out, it's okay. Poison gas, right. It's the first time poison gas was used in the war, and the Canadians held back. I'm not going to put the whole note down. We spent a lot of time on this in class. The Canadians held back the advance because, of course, they urinated in their handkerchiefs, right? So it's the first time Canadian troops fought as a unit. And remember, at that time, they were fighting in something called the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force. They had British commanders, and they were separated out as Canadians. So that was the first battle Canada took part in. The second battle would be the Battle of the Somme. Now, the Battle of the Somme we use as the ultimate example of a battle of attrition. That was the one I think we talked about. Didn't the British troops lose? What was the number? I don't know if I can remember. It was some incredible, like 48,000 men or something in one day. And in the opening day of the battle, which unit that wasn't quite Canadian yet but would be, was absolutely slaughtered? Newfoundland, brilliant. So the Newfoundland regiment was wiped out at the Somme, and we talk about the fact that July 1st in Newfoundland is a Memorial Day for that. Not even, they don't celebrate Canada Day. Wouldn't join the Federation until like 48 or 49. But they remembered for being wiped out there. What weapon was first introduced at the Somme? The tank, great. And the tank was an offensive weapon, but it didn't work very well in World War I. It would work great in World War II. So the Somme, and again, this is provincial exam prep, so I quickly go through these, but the best way I have to help you remember is that Ypres is gas, and the Somme is tanks and Newfoundland, so tanks, Newfoundland. The third battle, probably the most famous battle for Canada, at least maybe in both World Wars, would be, nice, he takes one of the only copies, I'll make more of those later, it's all right. Battle of Vimy Ridge. Now, Vimy Ridge is really famous for Canada because Canadians would use creeping barrage, a crawling barrage, and Canadians would be successful. The most important part, and set you up very well for this, was the first time Canada fought as a unit. They put the Canadian forces all together as the Canadian Army, or they call it the Canadian Corps. So the Canadian Corps would fight as one. They would attack Vimy Ridge using something called a creeping barrage or a crawling barrage. And you'll remember that was the artillery landed in front of the men as they move forward. And this was a victory. And it was a great victory. It was one of the first times the British had attempted to take Vimy Ridge and failed. The French had attempted to take Vimy Ridge and failed. And the Canadians, because of a huge set plan, had managed to capture this ridge on time in one day. And they had terrible casualties, but compared to the casualties in the war, actually they were quite light. So Vimy Ridge, and we'll be hearing lots about that in the next few years because it's 100 years is 2014. World War I started in the summer of 1914. So we will be inundated in the next couple of years with the 100th anniversary of the 100th anniversary of. So, you know, you can be sure we'll hear lots about Vimy Ridge. We won't hear very much about the Somme, and we'll hear very little, I believe, about the next battle, which is Passchendaele. And Passchendaele, which I can never spell correctly, so I'm just going to put lots of vowels in the middle. Passchendaele was also called the Third Battle of Ypres. It's basically in the same place. Basically in the same place. The reason Passchendaele, we remember Passchendaele, is it was fought basically in mud. It was called the Battle of Mud. It was terrible. And in fact, Canadian troops weren't even there at the beginning. The British had invaded. They had bogged themselves down. A guy named Haig, who'd said at the Battle of the Somme, was in charge. He did a terrible job. And they were just getting slaughtered, but they had to, in all wars, battles, you have to declare victory and then run away. Haig needed to find a way to win, so he called on his Canadians again. This time the difference was the Canadians came and they had their own general. What was his name? Arthur Currie. Good job. Never remembered that. I'm glad you're here. Arthur Currie would be Canada's general, and he would be the first time Canada would have her own general. And the Canadians actually successfully captured Passchendaele, the city of Passchendaele, or town of Passchendaele, I should say, what was left of it. So it was considered a Canadian victory, but it was at brutal cost. This was an absolute terrible battle, and it was really a waste of time. Right afterwards, the Germans attacked in a big spring offensive, took it all back. The Americans would enter the war. And if you remember, I was punching, you remember how I used to punch people in the face up at the front? Not literally. At the end of this, the Germans, right by the end of 1917, early 1918, were wearing themselves down. And the very last battle we need to remember here is called the 100 Days Campaign. And the 100 Days Campaign were the last 100 days of the war when the Allies had a whole bunch of victories on the Western Front. By the end of it, there were no more trenches. They'd moved out of the trenches and basically moved forward. There's still a few trenches around, but they moved forward. The Germans were in retreat and would actually end the war on November the 11th. Canadians, often called Canada's 100 Days because Canadians led many of the offenses. Unfortunately, some Canadians died, for instance, in the very last hour of the last day of the war on November the 11th, just before 11 a.m. in the morning. So that's the battles on the land. I would do this. If I was thinking about my provincial exam and I was thinking about it, I'm going to tell you how they ask. They will undoubtedly ask you some questions about the nature of the war, maybe one, and they're going to ask you at least one or two questions about, excuse me guys, about the battles. And when you think about the battles, just realize what they're going to do. And I hope you don't mind me doing this to you. This is what they're going to do. They're going to put these battles somehow in a multiple choice question, right? They're going to have Passchendaele with the 100 Days Campaign if they're being mean, and Vimy Ridge and Ypres, or Second Battle of Ypres. Then they're going to say gas, and you've got to figure out which one it is. Or they're going to be really evil. And when they're really evil, the nastiest questions they've asked, I'm not sure why they do this, but they've been asking these recently, is they'll have a map of Belgium and France there. And they'll say, ooh, which battle was which on these locations. So just please remember this, that Ypres and Passchendaele are both in what's called Flanders Fields. Right? Remember, our famous poet, he wrote his poem in Flanders Fields when he was in Ypres. Flanders is in Belgium. So Ypres and Passchendaele are both in Belgium, okay? Vimy Ridge and the Somme are both in France. I'm not sure of an easier way to teach that to you. You might remember Vimy Ridge is in France because France dedicated that land to Canada, remember? And the huge Vimy Memorial is actually on Canadian soil, which is in France. All right? I haven't left a lot of room for air and sea, but that's okay, because in World War I, how important was the war in the air? Really not significant at all. So if we're going to make a little side note about the war in the air, World War I was soft with camels, biplanes shooting each other down, and Zeppelins bombing London. It was insignificant in the end of the war, really. Towards the end of the war, they're having some impact, but not much. If you're thinking about the war in the air, what name should pop into your heads? Billy Bishop. There it is. Billy Bishop. Billy Bishop was, of course, the famous Canadian fighter ace. There were other fighter aces, but it's Bishop that we remember the most. Okay? So that's Billy Bishop, and that's all I would remember. If I was doing a full exam prep, I'm not expecting a whole bunch of questions on the war in the air. If there's going to be one, it'll be Billy Bishop. All right? War at sea. The war at sea in World War I is just the same as World War II. U-boats trying to sink convoys, remember? Okay, so the war at sea is still U-boats again, but the war at sea in World War I, although important, really didn't involve Canada as much. Does that follow? In fact, the only thing in the war at sea that we remember for Canada in World War I was the explosion in what city? Halifax. Okay, so the U-boats and the convoys, and of course we had the Halifax explosion, which was an accident. The war at sea, when we do the World War II review, the war at sea is much more significant. We're not talking about corvettes here and stuff like that. That's World War II. How'd we do?